Okay, this is sort of a part of segue into the North American part, but it's also just a short sort of addendum, if you would, to the sort of Latin America, the Americas discussion. I mentioned last time that this NAFTA and the South American one, and one of the side effects of NAFTA is what we call the maquiladoras. Maquiladoras is actually, on one hand, just a policy, which it says that basically, if you have say a production factory, you make Fords, or for example, my car, if you have a Fiat, if you make that Fiat in a particular place, even though it's outside of the United States makes an agreement that that car will actually be labeled as having been built in the United States. This allowed American manufacturers to chase down cheap labor in Latin America, so that they can remain competitive with foreign companies. So you get the weird situation. For example, the maquiladoras is also a technical term for what's generally seen as sort of like a 100-mile belt, if you go here, between Mexico and the United States. So it's in Mexico, like Nogales, for example, Agua Prieta, San Luis Colorado, most famously San Mexicali, Ciudad Juarez. Those areas within Mexico. But what you find is large numbers of American factories. And so when NAFTA comes into play, one of the deals that NAFTA sets up is that the United States wants to keep production in the Americas. The United States manufacturers want to appear that they could say made in the United States. But the production labor costs in the United States are considered too high with unionization and all the rest of it. And so what you do is you have to shop it out somewhere else. So, in Asia, for example, in Asia, this was, you had the factories in Japan, the factories in Japan moved to China, the factories in China have moved to Vietnam, Malaysia, et cetera, chasing cheaper labor. So basically when NAFTA set up the United States, tells, one of the pressures for NAFTA were American manufacturers saying, we're just going to shut down all operations in the United States and, just move them to Asia or wherever, because we can't afford to be competitive given the labor cost. And also things like environmental costs. And so what happens is when NAFTA comes in, the United States tells, especially Mexico, since Canada doesn't really care, basically tells Mexico, what we're going to do is we're going to provide you with factories. And that means that you're going to have a lot of decent paying jobs. And what you have to do then is basically within this belt of area that's between the United States and Mexico, within Mexico, but, is going to have sort of ambiguous relationship. They're under Mexican law, they're under Mexican environmental law, which is really pretty much non-existent. So all of a sudden, that means if I'm an American manufacturer, I can build a factory in Mexico. I don't have to follow EPA regulations in the United States. I don't have all the OSHA, health and safety regulations don't exist. I don't have to provide insurance for my employees. And I can pay them basically, squat compared to what, their counterpart gets paid, say, in El Paso. And so I love it if I'm an American manufacturer. And now they were the big push for NAFTA. Was that the American companies, in other words, the companies in headquarters that are based in the United States, could remain competitive globally because of this relationship we now have with Mexico, providing basically the cheap labor and the cheap location for factories that would not be allowed in the United States because of their pollution or other things, and factories that would not be viable because of the cost of doing operations in the United States. Most famously, it would be Harley. Harleys are actually produced outside of Ciudad Juarez somewhere. I can never remember where. And yet they're sold as made in the United States. And that was part of the deal with maquiladoras, as even though the factory isn't in the United States, it can have a label which says it's made in the United States. Now what you do is you take the Harleys, for example, I think everything but the wheels. So you leave the wheels off. You take it to a Harley assembly plant in Tucson or someplace else. They put the wheels on. You can say made in the United States, even though the entire thing is constructed in here. My Fiat, my Abarth, is made at a Fiat factory, Fiat Chrysler in Mexico. But they do the final assembly of the wheels and I think the steering wheel or something like that in the United States, and therefore it's an American-made car. Huge proportion of American products are actually made in this region. Now, for whatever set of reasons, Trump specifically tied illegal immigration into the United States with the existence of the maquiladoras, and was, basically sort of shut it down. There was a huge pushback from American production base because, of course, all of a sudden, places, someone like Harley would, for example, have to suddenly admit that their motorcycles are made in Mexico. And given how patriotic Harley likes to posture itself as, that would have been, marketing disaster. So a huge proportion of the American manufacturing industry, which is in large part based in Mexico, Chevy, Ford, Chrysler, you name it, just went absolutely berserk And so eventually when all the dust settled, as we have a new version of the NAFTA, whose acronym always escapes me, and the maquiladoras has pretty much stayed intact. But it's one of those weird situations that Americans like to say that, I like to buy stuff made in the United States or only buy American-made products. Well, I can guarantee a huge proportion of your American-made products are actually made in Mexico. And that's one of those sort of weird aspects. And this gets into what I sort of want to finish up on this, this whole sort of spin, because Americans have a very distorted view of the world around us. And one of the most problematic things from outside looking at the United States is the United States really has in its value system two sort of almost antithetical value sets. On one hand, the United States is very, very much tied to a sort of 10 Commandments, Christian idea that your neighbors are important, that there's, value in life, and, and all these type of, very sort of, high ethical, view of the world. And we tend to judge other societies, including Mexico, on the basis of those ethics. And so, that is part of the American ethical system. If you go to someplace like Hong Kong, or in fact, much of Asia, you won't find a humane society for animals. They just don't do it. The animals just walk around and the buggers die and they starve to death. And people go, that's too sad. But there's no idea that humans are responsible for other things in the planet necessarily. And in many places, like in China, for example, humans aren't really responsible for other humans. The relationships that people have are extremely strong between family and people they know. But if it's someone you don't know that's from somewhere you don't know, then you really don't see them in some ways, actually, by American standards, as being a human being. This is very typical in most of the world. So Americans do have a very strong ethical, sort of moral religious component, or I should say moral ethical component, based in sort of Christian theology or Christian ethics, that underlie the way that we view ourselves and view the world around us, and make judgments about the world around us. On the other hand, the United States is very, very heavily embedded, and this is a huge part of many of my other classes, in what I call the Calvinist work ethic, which is oftentimes called the Protestant work ethic in Europe. And one of the main tenets of this, especially the American form, which is tied to John Calvin and the whole idea of the, which often come to the Puritans, for example, the Mayflower guys, the Thanksgiving guys, which actually ironically come over here in 1821 as the missionaries that arrive in Hawaii are, again, basically the descendants of the Pilgrims, literally. So this particular form of Christianity, Calvinism, has a bunch of really strange components, which aren't really that relevant to this class. But the one that is really very relevant is the idea that everyone's an individual and working hard and making money and being successful is a huge part of actually being morally and ethically good. So you have these two sort of contradictions that on one hand, the group's supposed to be important. On the other hand, this idea of individuality, individual success is a huge part of the American thing. And you can see this anytime you're on Twitter, Instagram. Kardashians would be a stereotype of this. Because the main part about this idea of success is it gets defined with the idea of profit. And we might have gone over this at the beginning of the semester, just to reiterate, because now it's absolutely critical. When you think of profit means that, if I'm selling this rock to you, I'm going to sell this rock to you for more than my entire cost of the rock. So if I had to go pick this rock up, or we'll say I bought this rock for $1 and it got shipped to me for 50 cents. So my entire cost in this rock is, say, about $2. Profit means that I sell it to you for more than that. So I recover all of my cost of this object and I make something on top of it. That's the definition of profit. The American value system is very heavily based on the idea of profit, that you should not only get your money's worth, but you should get more than your money's worth, or your money's worth should include added value. You guys see this with the whole discussion about higher education, that higher education should be a profit-driven enterprise, that you should be able to pay a price to get an education. And when it's done, you should have X, Y, and Z as a result of that, which, at some level makes a little bit of sense. On the other hand, it's like a really sort of fleeky idea when you think about it for a second, as if knowledge is somehow a consumer item like a McDonald's, Big Mac. But this whole idea of profit is the other sort of balancing beam of this American concept, because you can only make a profit if someone else pays more than it's worth. So, the classic stereotype in the United States would be buying a used car, where a used car salesman sells you a car, and it turns out you paid a lot more than you should have for it. Well, he made a profit. If you go to Walmart, everything they sell, they make a profit on. So this idea of profit, if you go back to the Mexican situation, is you've got a factory making Harleys in Mexico. Well, if they're making Harleys in Mexico, they're going to make sure that their entire cost of operations, including what to pay the employees and everything else, doesn't come anywhere near what they're going to charge for the motorcycle. And that's their profit margin. And that's so embedded in the American logic because it's a major part of self-identity. Trump's a perfect case in point, not to bash on him, but just he identifies himself very strongly with the amount of money that he's made, that he's a millionaire, a billionaire, whatever it is. And therefore that actually makes his judgment more sound and this, that, and the other thing, just because he's made a lot of money. He's a walking, talking Calvinist. That's the value system. I should point out for much of the world, that's not true. People are really into making money almost everywhere, but they have a lot different value sets in terms of the motivations behind it. And in many cases, it's tied to the idea of family, where the idea that you make money because your family's status, certainly true in the Pacific here, your entire family is enhanced by virtue of the money that you make. So you don't do it as much for individual gain, you do it for your collective, family ethos. In the United States, it's individual based. So when we look at the American value system, on one hand, group's important, you should help people out, whether it be, Habitat or United Nations relief funds or, Meals on Wheels or whatever it might be. So the idea of helping others is a big part of it. Of course, it's a huge part of what this campus is about. The whole ethos of the Marianists is helping others. But on the other hand, the other half of the American ethos is taking advantage of others and getting more than what something cost. Excuse me. And this is the huge paradox in the United States, which makes this very hard to understand for much of the rest of the world. It doesn't hold those two contradictory value systems. And you see them in almost every discussion all the time here in the United States. Almost any news feed about any situation that's in the United States at some point or another will involve, on one hand, this idea of profit or someone making something or getting more than it cost out of it, or they should make a profit out of it. The idea that, that's a logical assumption. In contrast will be this idea of the value of helping others. Whether we look at homeless or whatever, it's this contradiction. It's a huge part of the American ethos that we don't really ever talk about a lot. We like to pretend we're the ethical side, but the reality is we're very much motivated by the profit side. And that's important to remember, that when you're looking at other people, Americans are very much people in glass houses throwing rocks with that ethical contradiction that makes it so. And I should point out it's not unique. Every society has ethical contradictions all the time. They're just different. But in the Americans' case, given the fact that we see ourselves as the one remaining superpower, those ethical contradictions, especially in the Americas with the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that we reserve the right to project force whenever we want to, have a huge impact on the rest of the planet and the people on the planet.